The Hollow Eyes. The town of Westbrook had always been quiet, its streets lined with ancient oak trees and cobblestone paths that seemed to have witnessed centuries pass. But for all its charm, there was something unsettling about it. A darkness that hung just beneath the surface, known to every resident but never openly acknowledged. A few weeks ago, Sarah Reed had arrived in Westbrook. She had come to visit an old friend, Rachel, who had recently moved to the town to start a new life away from the chaos of the city. At first, everything seemed perfect. Rachel's cottage on the outskirts of town was peaceful, surrounded by sprawling fields of wildflowers. It seemed like an ideal place to escape from the hustle and bustle of modern life. But as Sarah settled in, she began to notice strange things. It started with the children. Every time she went into town, they would stare at her. Not just glance, but stare, their eyes wide and unblinking, following her every move. It was unsettling, but she dismissed it as the oddity of a small town. Then there were the locals. They were polite, friendly even, but there was something cold in their eyes. It was as if they were watching her, waiting for something. Every conversation felt forced, as though there were topics they deliberately avoided. But what truly unsettled Sarah was the absence of any real history about the town. Rachel had mentioned that Westbrook had no records prior to the 1800s, as if it had suddenly appeared out of nowhere. One evening, Rachel invited Sarah to a gathering at the local tavern. The townspeople had gathered to celebrate the harvest, an event that, to Sarah's surprise, was not as joyous as it sounded. The air was thick with unease and the laughter felt hollow. As Sarah entered the tavern, she felt the gaze of every pair of eyes in the room turned toward her. They weren't friendly stares. They were calculating, assessing. It was as though they were waiting for her to make a mistake. The night wore on, and Sarah's discomfort grew. The music played softly in the background, and people talked in hushed tones. The only person who seemed to acknowledge her presence was an elderly man sitting by the fire. His face was wrinkled with age, but his eyes were sharp and intelligent. He had been watching her for some time, and when she met his gaze, he spoke in a low, gravelly voice. "You don't belong here," he said, his words sending a shiver down Sarah's spine. "You're not like them. They don't want you to stay." She tried to laugh it off, but something in his tone made her heart race. Before she could respond, he stood up and left the tavern, disappearing into the night without another word. The following day, Sarah tried to brush off the incident, but the feeling of being watched only intensified. As she walked down the quiet streets, she noticed that the townspeople were once again staring at her. But this time, it was different. Their eyes weren't just curious, they were hungry. Rachel had been distant ever since the night at the tavern, and Sarah found herself alone most of the time. That afternoon, she decided to visit the local library to learn more about the town's history. When she arrived, the library was eerily quiet, with not a soul in sight. She made her way through the rows of dusty bookshelves, searching for anything about Westbrook's past. It was in the back corner of the library that she found a book that caught her eye. It was old, its cover cracked and yellowed with age. The title was The Eyes of Westbrook. Sarah pulled the book from the shelf and began flipping through the pages. It told the story of the town's founding, how it had been established by a group of settlers in the early 1800s. But as she read further, she discovered something disturbing. The settlers had been searching for a place to escape a curse that was said to have followed them wherever they went. The curse was tied to the eyes. It was said that those who came to Westbrook would be marked by the eyes of the town's inhabitants, eyes that could see into a person's soul. It was said that the curse would eventually take hold, that the eyes would hollow out the soul of anyone who stayed too long in the town, turning them into nothing more than a vessel for the curse to feed upon. Sarah's hands trembled as she read. This couldn't be real. It was just an old legend, a myth. But as she glanced around the empty library, she felt the weight of something watching her. She slammed the book shut, her heart pounding in her chest. That night, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling of dread that clung to her. She tossed and turned in bed, the strange words of the book echoing in her mind. What was happening in Westbrook? Why did everyone seem so cold, so empty? The town felt like a trap, and she was the prey. The next morning, Sarah decided to confront Rachel. She needed answers, but when she arrived at Rachel's cottage, the door was locked. There was no answer to her knock, and Rachel's car was gone. Panic began to rise in Sarah's chest. She called out for Rachel, but the only response was the eerie silence of the town. Desperate, Sarah returned to the tavern, hoping to find someone who could help her. As she entered, the same uneasy silence filled the room. The locals were sitting at their usual tables, staring at her with those hollow eyes. But it was the bartender who caught her attention. He was standing at the counter, a strange smile playing on his lips. "Looking for someone?" he asked, his voice smooth and unsettling. "I think you know exactly where she is." Sarah's blood ran cold. "Where is Rachel?" she demanded, her voice trembling. The bartender simply smiled, his eyes darkening. "Rachel is with us now, just like you will be." Suddenly, the room seemed to tilt, the shadows around her growing darker. The locals began to stand, their movements slow and deliberate, encircling her. Their eyes were all fixed on her, those same hungry, hollow eyes. Sarah backed away, her mind racing. What were they? What had they done to Rachel? The bartender stepped forward, his smile widening. "You've been marked, Sarah. There's no escape from the curse of Westbrook. It's part of the town now, and soon you'll become one of us." The door to the tavern slammed shut, and Sarah realized with horror that she was trapped. The townspeople closed in on her, their faces twisted with an unnatural hunger. She felt her breath quicken, panic flooding her body. She had to escape. She had to leave before it was too late. But as she turned to flee, she saw something that stopped her in her tracks. Standing in the corner of the room was Rachel. Her once bright eyes were now empty, her face gaunt and hollow. She smiled, but it wasn't her smile. It was something darker, something twisted. "You're too late, Sarah," Rachel's voice echoed through the room. But it wasn't Rachel's voice. It was something else, something that sent shivers down Sarah's spine. "We are all part of it now, and soon you will be too." Panic surged through Sarah as the townspeople lunged at her. She struggled, trying to push them away, but their strength was too much. Their cold hands clutched at her, pulling her closer. She could feel her soul slipping away, consumed by the hollow eyes of the town. In her last moments, Sarah screamed. She screamed for help, screamed for freedom, but her voice was swallowed by the town, by the curse. And as the darkness took her, she felt the chilling sensation of her soul being consumed, her eyes becoming just like theirs, empty, hollow, and lost. Days later, a new face arrived in Westbrook. He was a traveler, seeking rest in the quiet town. The locals greeted him with warm smiles, their eyes gleaming with that same hunger. He noticed the strange stares, but dismissed them as curiosity. What he didn't know was that Westbrook had claimed another soul, and he was next. In the distance, the old library stood silent, its shelves filled with more stories. Stories of the eyes, of the curse, and of those who dared to enter Westbrook. Each one ended the same way, with the hollow eyes of its inhabitants, forever waiting for the next victim. And as the man wandered further into the town, unaware of the fate that awaited him, the curse of Westbrook continued, always hungry, always watching, always waiting for the next soul to claim.